Yes, it's true. Military missions are largely ignored. But if you think about what's happening right now in Iran, you see these huge aircraft carriers. You've got vast amounts of F-35 jets going up in the air.
That's completely agreeable. And, in recent years, we've also seen that you also mentioned that there has been a lot of increase in military spending. And
I mean, the things that you can invest in is really the things that I think we all know about, which is the solutions are in our, we know what the solutions are to climate change.
hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Front Seat to Climate Change. I'm Mahin. Today, we're exploring an issue that often sits just outside the climate conversation, but has enormous implications for our planet: the relationship between military activity, global conflict, and climate action. Military operations are widely understood to be extremely carbon intensive, yet, military emissions have historically remained one of the least transparent sectors in international climate reporting. Why have these emissions stayed largely outside the spotlight of global climate agreements? And what would real transparency and accountability in this space actually look like? At the same time, when conflicts escalate, governments can mobilize enormous financial resources for defense almost overnight. But the logic of a war economy, fast, reactive, and security driven, can clash with the kind of long term planning, cooperation, and sustained investment required for global climate transition. We're also seeing military spending rise sharply across many major economies due to increasing geopolitical tensions. What does this mean for global climate finance, particularly funding for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage in the countries that are most vulnerable to climate impacts? And when the global military expenditure reaches record levels, we also have to consider the opportunity cost. What climate solutions, technologies, and resilience investments might become possible even if a small portion of these resources were redirected? These choices also raise deeper questions about climate justice. Prioritizing defense spending over climate investment can reshape the already unequal relationship between countries most responsible for emissions and those most vulnerable to climate change. In many parts of the world, the regions facing armed conflict are also among the climate most vulnerable countries. How do ongoing conflicts make it harder for communities to pursue climate adaptation, resilience building, and sustained development? Some policymakers have also begun framing climate change itself as a security threat. Does this help mobilize stronger action, or does it risk encouraging militarized responses instead of cooperation and climate centered solutions? And finally, as the coming decades may be shaped by both rising geopolitical tensions and accelerated climate impacts, what risks does this combination pose for global climate cooperation and the ability of international institutions to coordinate meaningful climate action? To help us unpack these complex questions, we're joined today by Nick Buxton, researcher at the Transnational Institute. Hello, Nick. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So, when we think about the war in Iran, the human and political impacts dominate the headlines, right? But what are the environmental and climate consequences of this war that people may not be paying enough attention to?
Well, I think the first thing to realize is that a war is always not just a war on people, but also the environment in which they live. So it's having a very catastrophic impact in terms of the environment. Most obviously because war destroys the environment within which people live. Most catastrophically, we've heard of the killings of 175 schoolgirls, and so their entire environment destroyed. But also, war tends to target tends to target infrastructure, and infrastructure often involves uh, things like energy, which can pollute people, and also missile sites and other places where environmental toxins can be released. So what we've already seen in the war in Iran is that 30 oil facilities, largely around Tehran, a city of about 9 million people, were targeted by bombings. And this has released huge amounts of pollutants into the atmosphere, particularly something called black carbon, which is really causing. And I just saw a story today about someone speaking about the war and just unable to breathe and not being able to get the inhalers for it because it releases these very toxic black carbon into, and that causes respiratory problems. And of course, if you've got health issues, then that can make it a lot worse. And Tehran is actually in surrounded by mountains, so these toxins get kept within the area. So it causes real issues for breathing there. And then you've also had issue, and it also starts to pollute groundwater systems. So once you've bombed a refinery, those then enter into groundwater systems. We've had ships being targeted, particularly um, in the areas, the Iranian Navy, but also oil tankers have been hit, and that can really destroy marine environments. And also missile sites. They also that once you hit a missile, you get these liquid accelerants that you use for the propellants for the missiles. Those are often made up of very toxic chemicals, so those leak into the environments as well. So there is a real environmental impact, and that's not ignoring the fact that when you have a war, you're also producing huge amounts of military emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's these kind of long-term impacts, both on not just locally, but also globally, that will have impact on us all.
Definitely. And, military activity is also widely understood to be highly carbon intensive. Yet it has also historically remained as one of the least transparent sectors, when it comes to carbon emissions reporting. Why have emissions largely stayed outside, the spotlight of international climate agreements? And what would meaningful transparency and accountability in this area actually look like?
Yes, it's true. Military missions are largely ignored. But if you think about what's happening right now in Iran, you see these huge aircraft carriers. You've got vast amounts of F-35 jets going up in the air. You've got the missiles themselves being launched. It's a huge operation that depends on massive amounts of fossil fuels. And in wartime, it's even far more use than in normal times. But there are estimations that the greenhouse gas emissions make up to about 5.5% of global emissions. The Pentagon in the US is actually the single largest government producer of emissions in the whole of the US. And yet you're right, it doesn't get accounted for. So there is no requirement in international climate agreements to include military emissions in countries reporting. So when Pakistan or when the US reports its total emissions to the UNFCCC, the global body, or the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, it does not have to include military emissions. And yet we're increasingly realizing what a big part of the picture that is. And the reason goes back to the beginnings of the climate agreements back in Kyoto in the 1990s. They basically agreed, the US said it would only join the Kyoto Protocol, which it was called at the time, if its military was exempt. That exemption was partly undone in the 2015 climate conference, but it's still not. It's not no longer has to be excluded, but it doesn't have to be included. So it means that you get some countries reporting it, some countries not, and there's not even a standard about how they report it. So at the moment, we're left slightly in the dark as to how much emissions are produced, but there's calculations. You can base calculations on certain reporting that does happen. And it suggests that it's more than, for example, twice as much as civil aviation comes from the military sector. So it's something that there's a long demand to say we cannot ignore this side of things. And it's particularly important because we're in a time when military spending is going up at a large percentage rate. So something which is a small percentage now might become bigger over time.
Yes, exactly. And just adding to what you said, it does not really matter if it's a third world country or a first world country, because we see that, when conflicts escalate, governments are often able to mobilize massive financial resources for defense almost overnight. So from your perspective, I'd like to know, how does the logic and urgency of a war economy, clash with the kind of long-term planning, cooperation, and investment required for a global climate transition?
Well, I think we can see right now we've got a war of choice by the US. There was no sudden need. There was no even justification that this was a kind of a defensive war, which is often a false argument. But it's not even. There wasn't even a pretense this time. It was just we're going to do it. And it's costing. Some estimates are around. It's costing $1 billion a day. So we've had more than 2 weeks. We're already, probably at least an expenditure of $15 billion. And so the money's found overnight. There's no one saying, well, where's the money coming from? And we typically see this, that military and national security objectives override any others. And they become a justification in their own right. And no one's saying, well, where are we going to find the money for this? Um, and yet on climate, we're struggling to get the kind of resources we need. For example, there was an agreement way back in 2015, the Paris Agreement, that said we will mobilize $100 billion for the poorest countries. So the rich countries said we will, in addition, in agreement that we will all sign this agreement, we will mobilize these kind of resources for climate action, for both mitigation, for reducing emissions, but also to adapt to climate change. And that still hasn't been delivered fully in its promise. There have been amounts that are promised and sometimes delivered, but often it comes in way lower than the actual promises. And yet 15 billion over in 2 weeks is just blown away on bombing a country, and huge amounts of missiles and bombs and all the military apparatus to do it. So you just see this big discrepancy that goes on. And it's clear that what we need right now is investment in climate action. But instead, we're investing it in something that's actually making the situation much worse.
That's completely agreeable. And, in recent years, we've also seen that you also mentioned that there has been a lot of increase in military spending and across so many major economies due to, rising geopolitical tensions. In today's world, we actually safety is a big, big concern now because we actually do not know what's going to happen next. What implications, does this shift have for global climate finance commitments? Since you just mentioned the adaptation and mitigation, and we have funds like the loss and damage funds as well. So especially those funds that are particularly meant for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage in vulnerable countries, because climate change will not stop, right? It will trigger more and
Yeah,
more.
yeah, no, that's very much the case. I mean, we've reached this in 2025. The latest, we're going to get the latest statistics fairly soon, but in 2025 they reported that the world had spent 2.7 trillion on the military. Over the last decade, it's increased by 37%. So there's been a very steep trajectory of increased military spending, and it's going to go much higher than that. The war in Iran is one evidence of it. We clearly have a US which is, despite Trump's promise of the end to forever wars, is more belligerent and imperialistic than ever, and just sees a right to intervene wherever it wants in the world. But it's a trend. It's a global trend. So NATO as a whole has agreed, for example, to increase its military spending to 5% of GDP. And only a decade ago, the average was around 1.7%. So this is a huge increase. And yet, if we look at climate action, uh, one estimation is that the amount of money that we should be mobilizing each year for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage is 2.4 trillion. So it's less than the global military spend. Um, Even if we reduced military spending by 5%, we would release $135 billion a year for spending on this. And so we're seeing a huge diversion of resources towards militarizing the world rather than addressing what one could say is the biggest security, safety challenge that we all face, which is climate change. Pakistan knows that more than anyone in terms of the serious floods you had, for example, in 2010 and then again in 2022. People's safety and security depends on having a house. It depends on having a job. It depends on having an environment they can live. And yet with the extreme weather that happens as a result of climate change, and the health impacts that come of that, people are being affected by this daily. And yet when those crises come, we cannot find the resources to support people. And so there's a real kind of misdirection of resources at a time that we really need it, because that's the other part of this picture, is that there's a closing window. If we don't act in the next few years, then the situation gets more costly, both in terms of lives, but also economically, because you have to do more drastic efforts to reduce emissions in the time. That's why the UN says that we need to reduce by 2030, is this critical window, 2020 to 2030, where we really need to be throwing all our resources, all our global efforts towards tackling climate change. But the direction we're going, sadly, right now is very much away from that.
Absolutely. So, by now we've agreed that, the global military expenditure has, reached record levels, and climate change is one of the most pressing issues that we're facing, especially for countries like Pakistan and other vulnerable countries. So, when we think about, the opportunity cost of this spending, how should we understand it in climate terms? What kind of climate solutions or investments could potentially be unlocked if there's even a small portion of these resources that were to be redirected towards climate change?
Yeah, well, like I said, if this 135 billion would address huge amounts of these things, just a 5% cut. I mean, the things that you can invest in is really the things that I think we all know about, which is the solutions are we know what the solutions are to climate change. They are about shifting our entire power grids and from fossil fuels to renewable energy. They're about preparing communities to deal with the adaptation. So preparing communities to deal with increased heat, with increased flooding, building resilience of communities. And a small amount of money can go a long way. At the moment, though, we're getting no money going into those areas in the amounts that we need. And those are also not just about tackling the climate change. We know that as we build those kind of resilience into communities, that as we change energy systems, we're creating also environments which are much more facilitative for peace, because communities that are peaceful and where there's less conflict are ones that are resilient, that are also able to deal with climate change and with the other impacts that we can have impacting on different communities from a globalized economy. So all of these investments are really both about creating a response and protection from the worst impacts of climate change, but also about building a kind of more peaceful world. So the opportunity cost is huge, where we are missing by not investing in those things. We're making a world which is going to have more drastic climate change, but also the more likelihood of conflict and violence, in which, of course, the big powers such as the US are able to use those military powers to kind of control the situation and even exacerbate the situation. So it's really important that we kind of articulate globally, but particularly in the global north, the need to redirect our attention to making the world safe for everyone, because there's no chance for people in the US to be safe if the world isn't safe.
Absolutely. And, whenever we mention the word global north, we often associate it with the word climate justice as well. There's growing argument that, prioritizing military infrastructure and defense spending over climate investments, it raises serious questions about climate justice. How do these spending priorities, reshape the already unequal relationship between countries most responsible for emissions and then most vulnerable to climate impacts?
Yeah, I mean, it's a reality that we know that right now that those countries who are least responsible for the climate crisis, and I would include Pakistan as that. I mean, obviously, countries in Africa even more so. But countries that did not produce the world's largest amount of emissions, those are produced historically by the big colonial and imperial powers like US and the UK and European countries. They're the ones who historically produce most of the emissions, but most of the impacts land on countries in the global south who did not produce most of the emissions. So what happens with this situation is that we're exacerbating that. We're making the situation worse. So the huge amount of military spending is largely done by the biggest fossil fuel producers and consumers. So they're not only the ones who have caused the climate crisis, they're now exacerbating it by diverting all the money towards the military. So what it firstly does is it makes that unequal relationship even more unequal. And I think the second thing I would say is that what's increasingly happening is that as countries in the global north start to talk about security and national security and take a more belligerent kind of militarized response to the world, that militarized framework is entering into other relationships as well. So what we see in the European Union is that they are increasingly with particularly the North African neighbors saying, making aid agreements, for example, development or aid agreements, which emphasize security, but not security for Moroccans or Tunisians or Libyans, but security for Europeans in terms of stopping migration into the country. So you're starting to get a militarized framework affecting our relationships globally, between the global north and the global south. So this is a real concern of mine, that it's actually deepening some of these global inequalities, and that's going to deepen an injustice that has happened since colonial times, and it ultimately makes the world unsafe for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And it actually makes it harder for, communities and countries to pursue climate adaptation, resilience building, and, long-term sustainable development.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Yeah. So, some policymakers, they increasingly frame climate change itself as a national or global security threat. Do you think framing the climate crisis through a security lens helps mobilize stronger action, or does it risk, reinforcing militarized responses instead of encouraging cooperation and climate-centered solutions?
Yeah, I think the idea was that, and this was particularly in countries like the US, was that if we say that climate change is a security threat, then people who are prone to support the military and military spending, and don't see climate change as a justice issue, but would be more likely to say, okay, if it's a security threat, then we should address it. So the idea is it would bring on, particularly in the US, the Republicans on board, who tended to be more skeptical of climate action. Um, and it was a similar thing in the US. It was also, if we make it a security threat, then it will be given a greater priority in decision making. And it would be the same in Pakistan. If you say something is a security threat to Pakistan, then it gets more priority than other issues. So that was the idea. The trouble is that then the question is security for whom? And particularly in the global north, it's security for for the for the for the richest people in the country. It's around economic security, so it's protecting those who already have security. It's not really about those who are the most vulnerable. And climate change is often an issue of vulnerability. Who are the most vulnerable to climate change? The peoples who don't have proper infrastructure, who have poor housing, who live in areas that are prone to flooding or without any kind of places to cool in extreme heat. And a national security strategy rarely looks at that kind of looks at vulnerability, looks at those who have no security. In fact, it can make their situation more worse, because the solutions can then be, we need more military, we need more armed responses. We need, as we see in Europe, increasingly militarized borders to protect. And who gets affected? The migrants who are vulnerable and trying to flee from places. We saw this in the US in Katrina, where really vulnerable people after a hurricane caused by climate change faced armed police and got shot because they were seen as potentially looters. And so often a security response can make people actually more insecure. So that's why my concern is that we should really return to a framework around justice, because if we really want to protect those who will be most affected by climate change, what we need to be looking at is protecting the most vulnerable. And that requires an issue of justice. It's like, why are people more vulnerable? How do we make situations more equal? How do we level up things so that people who are most vulnerable are protected? And I don't think a security framing does that, because it actually just reinforces injustice rather than tackles it.
Agreed. I think this issue deserves, long-term planning and commitment and seriousness from, policymakers all around the world, instead of, framing it as a threat. It is a threat, and, it is over here, and it's a reality that, we cannot avoid. Okay, so Nick, just to wrap up the conversation, I'd like to ask you that, if in the coming decades they're shaped by both geopolitical tensions and accelerating climate impacts, what risks does this combination pose for global climate cooperation and the ability of international institutions to coordinate meaningful climate action?
Well, like I said, earlier, we are in a situation where we have a short window to act, and we need to take fairly drastic action, and it needs to be globally planned and globally cooperated. So it's deeply disturbing right now that we are getting to this much more situation of belligerence, of increasingly militarized responses, people building up their military budgets. And when you build up budgets and it's fuel, you give more power to the arms industry, you make the likelihood of war ever greater. And that means that we're not getting the kind of cooperation we need. Because ultimately climate justice globally will be delivered when the global community gets together and says, this is a global priority. We need to address this, and we need to take the action required. War will distract from that. It will divert resources from it. It will break down relations. It will stop cooperation. It will make the situation worse, because, like as we've seen in Iran, you get increased emissions, you get increased environmental contamination. So I think Iran is going back to Iran where we started, and which is very much in our minds right now, should be a wake-up call that this kind of action is actually adding fuel to the fire of climate change rather than trying to dampen it down. And that we cannot have these wars which cause the loss of innocent lives, destructions of environment. It's completely the wrong direction to go. Instead, we should be using the sheer power and logistical force that someone like like a country like the United States has to wage these things. That same energy should be put instead into addressing climate change, to build in peace, because we have the capability to solve the climate crisis. We just need to have the will, and to do it.
Absolutely, like you said, that this should be a wake-up call for us, especially, the Iran war. Today it's Iran, tomorrow it could be, us. So we have the resources. We just need to, act towards it, and we all need to cooperate in an extremely peaceful manner. Thank you so much, Nick, for sharing your insights and helping us unpack the complex relationship between militarization, global security, and climate crisis. So today's conversation reminds us that climate action doesn't happen in isolation. It's deeply connected to political priorities, global power dynamics, and how societies choose to allocate resources. As we think about the future, and this challenge will be ensuring that cooperation, climate justice, and a long-term sustainability should take precedence over short-term security responses. Thank you so much, everyone. See you next time.